Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. Before we get started today, I wanted to mention very quickly that AIBS's online Writing for Impact and Influence course has been moved to a September start. The course is all about helping scientists use modern tools and publication platforms to reach the general public and stakeholders to tell the story of their science, and also why it's important. There's a link with more information in the show notes, but feel free to email me any questions at bioscience@aibs.org. Moving on to today's episode, I was joined by Dr. Kristy Ferraro, who's a Banting postdoctoral fellow at Memorial University in Newfoundland and Labrador. She's an ecosystem ecologist and conservation ethicist interested in the ways that animals and humans drive ecosystem function. And our second guest is Adam Meyer, a PhD candidate in the Ecosystem Ecology Lab, also at Memorial University. He's worked on the role of animals in biogeochemistry, but in addition to that, he's an educator with a background in K-12, curriculum development, and science communication and training. They were here to talk about their recent article in BioScience, Beyond Hero and Villain Narratives in Ecology and Conservation Science, in which they discuss a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, the role of storytelling in science communication. So with no further ado, let's go to the interview. Thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having us. We're delighted.
Thank you.
Okay, so I thought we could get started with a little bit of a chat about the idea of storytelling in ecology and conservation biology. And specifically, I'm kind of wondering about the role that it plays in conveying ecological and conservation knowledge. How does that kind of appear in the system and in articles? And why do we tell those types of stories?
Well, I think that storytelling in general is just a huge part of how we communicate with one another, not just as scientists, but in general. We're constantly listening to and telling stories. Like if I listen to the news or I talk to my family or my kids in the evening about, how was your day? It's often a story. So it's a really fundamental form of communication just in most everything that we do. And so it makes total sense, I think, to me that when we communicate our science and the results of our studies, that those come in the form of stories. I think it's important. I mean, I'm pro story. I like telling stories. In fact, I love stories, and that's part of why I really enjoyed helping to write this project. But I think stories are really important to the science that we do because they help people remember them. They help with people to understand the work that we're doing and the potential impacts of them. So I think just storytelling in general is a really important part of how we communicate the results of science.
Yeah, and I would add that it's particularly important and useful in conservation and ecology because we're trying to describe and convey very complex interactions and systems and processes. And so stories can really help us both make sense of those things ourselves and make sense of them for our colleagues and the public.
Yeah, and I think a really good science story, whether it's from a paper or a talk or whatever, really helps the listener or the reader take information and turn it into an idea that they can operationalize for themselves and make sense of and take further.
One of the things that was interesting to me about this article is that you observe a very particular type of narrative of storytelling. The hero-villain narrative is one that appears very frequently, and it strikes me that this is something that we rarely talk about, and that this, kind of just stems from, a variety of factors and, the way that people interact with the stories that we tell. So can you tell us a little bit about, the hero-villain narrative and, kind of how that winds its way into ecological storytelling?
Absolutely. So the hero-villain narrative is probably a structure we're all very familiar with, right? There's a hero, and that's someone we're rooting for, a protagonist, and then there's a villain who is maybe posing obstacles or causing a threat. And so it's a really common narrative trope that we're used to in film and literature. And it's become very pervasive in ecology and conservation, I think for several reasons, but I'll just talk about one. And that's because conservation and a little bit ecology has values and urgency so deeply entangled in these fields, especially conservation. So there's often this clear sense of what is worth protecting and what's seen as threatening that protection. So this moral framing is already baked into our conception of conservation and ecology, which makes it really easy and almost natural to reach out for that narrative structure that aligns with these values. I'll provide an example. So, like, take an old growth forest, right? Conservationists and ecologists place really high value on these ecosystems, and that's for a good reason. I'm not questioning that. But once we've decided that old growth forests are good, anything that alters or threatens them can easily be cast as a villain. So whether that's a deer or a non-native species or logging or fire, that storytelling almost writes itself. We've got something sacred that's under threat, and then we've got something or someone that must be blamed. So I think that's why it's so natural in conservation and ecology specifically that we see this trope.
Right, but as you point out in the article, it falls short in a lot of cases. What are some of the ways that it could, potentially not, tell the full story or could, lead us astray, as it were?
Well, I think one of the main ways that the hero villain trope fails us is that we think a lot in science when we're designing studies and when we're reporting studies. We think a lot about information that we want to convey and the bounds of the information that we can fairly report. And so I think intentionality there is really, really important. And we think a lot about like using theoretical frameworks and statistical analyses with intentionality. And I think one of the things that we sort of learn and argue in the paper is that you can and should use narrative with the same intentionality because it's not just a neutral party to the information that you're conveying. It includes information in and of itself. And I think that if you're not aware and you're not using narrative structures with intentionality, there's a risk there that you're conveying information that you don't intend. And I think anytime we do that, there's a danger to that in science.
Yeah, there's also a danger of oversimplification. Ecological systems, socio-ecological systems are extremely complex. And when we boil things down into a villain and a hero, it really flattens a very vibrant, complex narrative. I think, a great example of this is human-wildlife conflict. So let's take, for example, wolves. They're often portrayed both in our fiction narratives and also in science writing as kind of threats to livestock or livelihood. And not to say that they aren't threats, but they're not intentionally doing that harm, right? A wolf isn't acting out of malice. It's following instincts. It doesn't, look out onto a field and choose your sheep over a wild prey species because it wants to harm you. It chooses what's accessible and available. And so framing that animal as a villain really flattens the socio-ecological complexity that wolf and those humans are navigating. And we think it makes it a lot harder to have constructive conversations about coexistence or ecological systems or complexity when we've got this flattened narrative.
Yeah, and because I think there's an unintended moral blame underlying villainhood, right? Like a villain is a human construct, and part of being a villain is not just like producing a bad outcome that people don't like, it's being morally bad. And so we hold villains morally accountable in our human construct. And I think most would agree that like that kind of a moral accountability responsibility, the analogy really breaks down when you're talking about plants and animals.
Yeah, and just running with the wolf example for a moment, if you were looking at them and portraying them primarily as villains, you would obviously miss things like their role as ecosystem engineers, that might allow elk to be better controlled potentially, or the ecosystem restoration role that they play, in addition to the livestock predation role. You kind of miss that complexity if you take that sort of reductive approach of good guys and bad guys, as it were.
Absolutely. And I think because Adam and I are both ecosystem ecologists, we're always kind of thinking in like a networky way, like how are the different relationships influencing the cycles of, populations or materials or elements. And it's never simple, right? We never get to just write a story like, animal impacts XYZ variable in a simple way. It's always so complicated. And I think that's one of the reasons we particularly were drawn to thinking about ways in which we could talk about that complexity rather than flatten it.
Yeah. And because it's so easy to do. Like
Mm.
I communicate in this, I use this trope. And in writing the paper and reflecting on my own presentations and things, it was apparent to me that like I absolutely do this. Last year I gave a talk just here at Memorial University about my work, which is about my PhD work, which is about the role of moose in biogeochemical cycles here in Newfoundland. And part of that is looking into trampling as a mechanism. So trampling effects on soil physical structure and nutrients and microbial communities. And so I gave this talk, and then one of my friends and colleagues came up after the talk and very sincerely asked, like, that's a really interesting talk, but like, what is the solution? Like, how do you get a moose to stop trampling on the soil? And I was really struck by that question. I thought it was a great question because it revealed to me that I very obviously was conveying information in the way that I framed the story that I didn't intend. Like I had made moose and moose trampling like a bad guy, a villain to the like heroic soil processes that I built up as being so important, which was not my intention and is not really how I view the system anyway. So I think it's very easy to do, and it's our hope with this paper that in pointing out some of the problems, we make people more aware of it, but also to give some solutions for like alternative narratives you might consider like while you're writing your papers.
Yeah, and I want to jump into those, solutions very soon. But I was hoping we could chat just a second about something that I found very interesting, which was the potential for, these narratives to have an influence on the way that the science itself can be conducted or the conservation actions can be conducted, that it can kind of feed back in and wind up guiding or steering the way that people think about various ecosystem players from your side of the equation as well.
Yeah, I think a really resonant example for me was recently I had the chance to spend about 3 months in New Zealand, which was wonderful and beautiful, and it's a fantastic place with fantastic people. And obviously, New Zealand is facing a lot of challenges for their native populations because there are non-natives which were introduced by humans on the island. Now, the fact that they were introduced by humans, sometimes is mentioned, sometimes is ignored and kind of pushed to the side. And I'll push that to the side for now too. But I get there and, I'm doing all the wildlife tours because I'm an ecologist and what else do we do? And I'm looking around me and there's all of this, for lack of a better word, propaganda, where they've got the, predators depicted as like truly cartoon villains, like red beady eyes, the rats had fangs, which, physiologically I had questions about. And it was like this really intense moment where I was like, whoa, these beings are being morally blamed and held accountable for something that they really have no control over. They were brought here by humans, and they're really just acting on instincts. That isn't to diminish the fact that they are clearly causing a large change to the ecosystem that is against what the people of New Zealand value. I don't want to underestimate or undermine that. But I think by depicting them in this villainous way, it allows for and motivates really horrific harms to those individuals. So what I mean by that is it perpetuates biases against that can lead to policy that is pretty harmful physically for those beings that can feel pain, right? So instead of trying to find creative ways for population management or solutions, it's like, how do we go about killing these animals and not considering their pain tolerance at all? And that to me is one of the ways in which this use of this trope can have real consequences, both in policy and on the actual lives of individuals who, again, I'm not saying they don't need to be managed, but probably should be managed in a thoughtful way.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example. And if I could add one thing, I just really recently, just this week, I saw a new paper that came out in Nature by I think Ellis and colleagues, that is about creating a new aspirational index for societal relationships with nature to complement the Human Development Index. And in the paper, they argue that humans are often portrayed and see ourselves as like perpetual villains in our relationship with nature, like we're only destroyers, and the best that we can hope for is to just limit the damage that we're doing. And so by changing that narrative and releasing humans from this like villainous role, they come to what I think is a really interesting and exciting creative solution, which is a new index that considers human integration and value and sustainability of our relationships with nature. And I think that's one of the examples, not just of a harm, but like a benefit from if you can release from these like hero villain narratives of the kinds of creative solutions that can come away from that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, so you then have the opportunity to, kind of view things in a holistic way and get at explanations that allow us to, in a sense, see ourselves in a more realistic way. And potentially, I'm just guessing here, see the ways that we can be a positive contributor into those systems as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm wondering now a little bit about the potential solutions. So we've got this narrative structure that we seem to kind of hew to very naturally, and it appears often, and not to make a villain out of the hero-villain narrative, but it doesn't necessarily get the job done in all cases. What are some of the better narrative approaches that would, allow a little bit more of a, kind of complete understanding of what's going on, and that would guide our thoughts and actions in a more constructive manner?
Yeah, so this was the whole second half of the paper is focused on solutions. And so we offer 7 different kinds of narrative structures that we think would work really well with storytelling in ecology and conservation science. I'm sure there are more kinds of narratives that we didn't include in here, but we thought these 7 were a good start. And they kind of range from, we start with ones that I think would be intuitive and people would be familiar with. And then as we go down the list, they get a little more into kinds of narrative structures that I think people might not intuitively think would work well with ecological stories, but they do. So just to give you 2 quick examples, the first one is called a place-based narrative. This is one I think that ecologists will be familiar with from beloved documentary series such as Planet Earth or March of the Penguins. Or even just classic ecological writing. I'm thinking of like Cowell's Dune Ecosystems of Michigan from like 1899, which you can get in the Foundations of Ecology anthology. But this is a kind of narrative which is focused on a place and a time. And I think Cowell's, we even quote from Cowell's because there's such a great example of how you can create tension in a place-based narrative without having a hero or villain. So, for example, Cowles writes, "There's perhaps no topographic form is more unstable than a dune," which that statement is already awesome. Plants are obliged to adapt themselves to a new mode of life within years rather than centuries, the penalty for lack of adaptation being certain death. So he's like he's giving you the environment, he's giving you the characters that are involved, he's giving you attention. They're without a moral framework that doesn't make sense, but in a way that is like totally compelling. So that's place-based narrative. And if you'll indulge me for a second.
Please.
Yeah. So another one that I really like and I identify with a lot that I want to really try to use in my science writing is the character study. So a character study is where the focus of the story is on a character, and we draw on examples where it's about people, like Love in the Time of Cholera and other examples. But you can do this with animals and with plants, where you're really focused on this character, and there's a behavior that you don't understand, or there's a pattern that you don't understand, and it's because you don't fully understand how this character ticks. And so the character study over time reveals pieces of this character that were mysterious or missing before. And as you gain like a fuller understanding of that character, it really opens up, like the connections between the character and the environment become much more clear because you know how the character works. that is much more in line with like how I think of my systems, whether it's moose um, or other organisms and ecosystems. And so I think if you're looking for a narrative structure alternative to hero and villain as an ecological writer, I think place-based narrative and character studies are like great places to start.
Yeah, and then if you're a little more ambitious and want to try something
Adventurous, yeah.
adventurous, a little out of the norm, one of the ones that I just had a great time thinking about and writing about is the will they or won't they structure, right? This is the kind of tension that we see in rom-coms or just roms, right? Like Pride and Prejudice or When Harry Met Sally. And it turns out that this kind of structure works really well in ecology. So, for example, take partial migration, which is this idea that some animals in a population might migrate while others would stay put. And we as scientists are still really trying to figure out why certain individuals make different choices. From partial migration, is it food availability? Is it predators? Is it social cues? So framing the research around this central and unresolved question of will they migrate or won't they kind of builds this suspense and keeps readers really engaged. And I think it's a really great way to reflect on some real uncertainty and complexity in ecological and animal systems without the need to cast anyone as a hero or villain. And I think like Matt Kaufman's work and Arthur Middleton's work, where they write about all sorts of different ungulate migrations, have really used this narrative structure well. It's really fun to see. And then one last one. I promise we won't go through all seven, but we had so much fun writing them.
Yeah.
One of the other ones we had a lot of fun with was The Inconvenient Prophecy, which of course is all about a character being faced with an uncomfortable future and then having to figure out what to do in that scenario. And in ecology and conservation, this tension shows up all the time. I mean, climate change is just the perfect example, right? So in that story, right, maybe we have a plant species which has seed germination that really depends on that perfect right timing. But what happens when climate change causes seasons to shift? Suddenly, we've got this looming risk that things won't sync up anymore. And the consequences of that could be really big. And so this kind of framing doesn't rely on villains. Instead, it creates this kind of narrative tension by asking how will species or ecosystems or individuals or even people adapt or fail to adapt to what's coming. And so I think this is a really powerful way to communicate the urgency of environmental problems that we face right now, while still leaving room for resilience and complexity and creative solutions.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you mentioned that one too, because I'm an English major and I work with scientists pretty often in helping them kind of learn how to write about their research in a way that will be compelling to the general public. And I've noticed as I was reading your article that that's one that I use constantly. That climate change narrative as the inconvenient prophecy is something I've relied on almost nonstop over the years, and it's incredibly valuable. And I think one of the things that's really striking about it and the other approaches that you lay out is that they maintain the same level of tension that you would get from the traditional hero villain narrative. A lot of times we tell stories and part of it's creating the sense that something is at stake. And I thought that was a great element of this article, being able to find other ways of creating that tension that's potentially truer and more reflective of the underlying situation and the science.
Yeah, Adam and I are lucky. We both have humanities training, and I think we were able to pull on that quite a bit. And I think it's something that makes us good collaborators and have such fun conversations. I did a 4 years great books course and a philosophy degree. Adam, you did.
I also have some American lit background and just like writing in political theory and where there's a lot more explicit training on like argumentation and narrative structures and like just what is a narrative. We're also just both really avid readers of fiction, which is another thing that, I mean, it's not in the paper necessarily, but I see so much value in, as a scientist, reading fiction. We read so much nonfiction all the time as part of our work, but I find it like it's great to get the creative juices flowing, but also just as like a catalyst for writing and for thinking about narratives and even just being open to letting nature and your data reveal to you new narrative structures. I think reading fiction is a good source for that because that's where you get a lot of sources of great new narratives that are entirely novel to you is in great fiction writing. So yeah, I see tons of value in just reading a lot of fiction as a scientist.
Yeah, as an English major, I absolutely am unable to disagree with you in any way. So I guess one last question, and I think you've partly answered it already, but how did this paper come about? Is this something that you've been thinking about for a while? Did something in particular sort of gain your attention that made it a story worth telling right now? How did this come about?
Yeah, so this paper really began in the fall. As a lab group, Adam and I are both in Sean LaRue's lab here at Memorial University. We were rereading collectively Writing Science by Josh Schimmel. And Schimmel encourages scientists to think of variables as characters when crafting narratives. And that idea really stuck with us. And around the same time, Adam and I had been spending Thursday afternoons in a little ritual where we'd have a beer and a brainstorming session. We'd catch up and share new science we'd come across. And more often than not, we'd just end up talking about deer. It's a study species that we love a lot.
Yeah, we love deer.
We love deer.
Yeah.
So we were kind of having these parallel conversations, one about writing and one about deer. And I was reading deer papers, and I started to notice how often deer in particular were described in these moral terms as invaders, as destroyers, and as problems to be solved.
Yeah, and so at like one of these Thursday sessions, Kristy came in like fired up. She was really fired up from reading some deer papers, and came in with this was a very compelling outline of how the words that people choose to describe deer and the framing around the ecological systems just have a lot of moral framework, like human moral framework, that doesn't make sense when you're talking about an animal. And it can be potentially damaging and convey information that you don't intend and flatten the complexity of ecological systems. So it was a really compelling idea to me. And so as she was describing it, I was like, oh yeah, I think there's something there.
Yeah. And so I came in pretty hot, saying I wanted to write out, this paper and lay out all these issues. And Adam was really the one who grounded the idea and pushed it forward. He was like, look, everything you're saying is true. I agree. But if we're going to critique how scientists are writing, we have to give them another way forward. We have to propose alternative narrative structures for scientists to use. And I think that's what really completely shifted my thinking, our thinking. From there, we really started talking about, what sorts of tools were available, ones that we loved from fiction and literature and film that we, were reading and watching, and how those could be adapted to science writing to make it more nuanced and creative and kind of reflective of the complexity of ecological systems. So Adam really brought this curiosity and also, how we could move beyond just a critique into something generative.
Yeah. Yeah. So we pretty much had an outline from, it was like a beer session, pretty much. Yeah.
Bit of an apocryphal, magical moment where you sit down with a friend and have an outline by the end of the afternoon.
Yeah. It was very fortunate.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that with me and for joining me today. I think that's a great story too. And I'm very grateful for your time today. This has been a great episode, and I'm looking forward to getting it out.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.